Welcome, everybody in Taiwan and in the rest of the world. My name is Georges Bloch from IRCAM and Strasbourg University, and my talk will be based on the performance of the piece Three Ladies project shown online. This presentation will emphasize the role first-rate performers play in our research. For any composer, working with first-rate performers is an obvious wish. However, a large number of IRCAM researchers, notably in the music representation team headed by Gérard Assayag, believe it is also crucial in computer music research. Rather than claiming to be able to design machines that are intelligent by themselves, we think it is better to speak of co-improvisation of performers and machines. Professional musicians are perfectly aware that machines are able to perform tasks beyond their realm. As soon as 1986, I was advocating composed improvisation in order to take into account the incredible capacity of a machine to memorize music. Now, much more sophisticated processes can be achieved, allowing to consume musical memory from any musical flow or repertoire. This memory can be invoked in many ways to fit into some kind of scenario or even to be invoked in reaction to what the musician is currently playing, like a listening of the performance. But even in this last case, the result, generally arresting, is rarely musically sufficient by itself. The resulting environment, with concurring propositions coming from the machine and the performers, are often interesting and sometimes fantastic. So, my talk is entitled 3, 4, 5 Ladies and Performing with Them, but it deals mostly with the concept of a co-creation setup with human musicians and machines. We'll briefly examine the setup of Three Ladies from a musical point of view, centering on the respective roles of the performers and the machine. We'll actually describe two setups nicknamed Infernal Machine 1 and Infernal Machine 2 by the pianist Hervé Sellin. The software used is DICE2 by Jérôme Nica. I invite you to follow his talk, in which you will learn a lot about the very elaborate conceptual aspect of the software and about its implementation. This talk will be more geared towards aesthetics. The following example is taken from a rehearsal of the September 5th concert. It took place in IRCAM at the end of August and was luckily captured by the famous filmmaker Nourit Aviv.
Slow man I love, and when it comes my way, I'll do my best. Let me smile. And he'll be big and strong. And when it comes my way, I'm really not
In the video shown, as in the concert performance, we can see two performers, a pianist producing sound and a computer operator. An improvising machine producing sounds. Obvious as it is, there is an acoustical feedback and we should emphasize it. Both performers react in real time to the output of the machine, as in any kind of instrumental situation. A pianist performing, for instance, a Beethoven sonata listens to the sounds coming out of his piano or her piano, and his or her further interpretation is guided from what has just resounded. Actually, performers, even when improvising, often follow some kind of text. If not a score, it could be a grid, an outline, general direction. You take the second solo, things like that. There is symbolic output as well. The machine displays some information about its state, either on the screen or by way of some musical symbols. The computer operator can change the output of the machine, even as, in the example above, shut it up. The fries is a very powerful effect with a performer of the class of Hervé Sellin, even if at that particular moment he was probably thinking, this infernal machine is not functioning again. It never works, and I always have to do all the job. In a less dramatic fashion, the process and therefore the output of the machine can be modified by the operator rounding off the feedback loop. The diagram we just saw shows a basic interactive setup, not very different from the first computer music setups of interactive music. In his piece Solo from 1978, Joel Shadby was producing real-time frequency modulation sounds with the New England digital synthesizer, organized through an interactive compositional process. By the way of both theremin antennas, the performer could modify the synthesis parameters and the note density. In some way, this piece was inspired by David Tudor Rainforest, 1960, an analog electronic music installation living its own life. The term rainforest being a metaphor for an autosufficient ecological environment. The installation was in theory auto-maintaining itself, but by touching resonance sensor-equipped surfaces, the dancers of the Merce Cunningham Company were altering the balance of the various electronic devices and its evolution. Why these historical examples? Because at that time, Shadby was already expressing something about co-improvisation. He stated that a composing computer could be used either according to the car paradigm, one follows a road or another in order to reach a destination, or according to the sailing boat paradigm. The path is constantly modified along the varying natural elements. On the right, you see how the sailing boats racing around the world try to avoid the low winds of the St. Helena anticyclone. But it all depends on their speeds, on the local conditions, and on the motion of the anticyclone itself. Shadby actually preferred the boat approach. He said it was better for the computer to propose an environment rather than a statement. The Three Ladies project is different. It uses an existing repertory, that is, the pieces sung by the three ladies. At start, it's Billie Holiday singing The Man I Love, Lisa della Casa singing Mitradi from Mozart Don Giovanni, and Edith Piaf singing Mon Dieu. In order to use this repertory, it should be analyzed and segmented according to parameters considered as relevant. Several models could coexist this way. The repertory becomes a memory. This memory can be deduced from any musical input, including what is being played during the show by the piano or any instrument. If memory model can include some measure of distance between its elements. A logical navigation inside the memory is made possible. This kind of free navigation in our case is the OMAX model, and it's largely documented, therefore I will not spend time on it. But I will spend time on the existence of a scenario, characteristics of the so-called infernal machine 1 or improtech. The beginning of the piece is actually using the harmonic progression of George Gershwin, The Man I Love. This entails that the memory model and the scenario have compatible descriptors, more than that, inclusive ones. In order to be able to force the navigation inside the memory model, in this case, memory model and scenario are using grid-like descriptors, that is, chord notation per beat. It's important to understand that very different descriptors can be used, as we will see later. Needless to say, the scenario can be modified. The same Mozart aria, here sung by Elisabeth Schwarzkopf, also fits perfectly the scenario of Autumn Leaves, played by Hervé on the piano. By the way, the Three Ladies project uses concatenative synthesis. That is, it's splicing and pasting samples, like a lot of people do right now in the musical world. We should say that in no way it's an absolute rule. We welcome all transformations, synthesis, generation, and so on. The problem is that musical memory is often represented as an annotated recording with a multi-dimensional database, which is where the cleverness lies. Another point about concatenative synthesis is that it's image friendly. If the music is made by splicing, film music, using film music, you just splice corresponding images. But this is a danger also, because the presence of images is powerful and can become sort of tyrannical, and the people are expecting images instead of listening. OMAX video is Max jitter program, allowing to have synchronized images with the programs of the OMAX family. It separates sounds and images. So that is, you separate, if you use a film, you separate the sound and image and create a table of correspondence between the date of the sound file and the image. The idea is to have a more sturdier setup by having sound and images working on different computers. The sound dates and film references are sent via OSC on the net, and the video software take care of the rest. Can deal with 4 different video streams corresponding to 4 audio voices and some effects, and a possible rendering on a split screen, either 1 or 4 or 9 or 16 subscreens, with a matrix allowing to distribute the images. In the Infernal Machine 1, the scenario can be modified on the spot, and that's the way we get from The Man I Love to Caravan. But actually there's a catch, because the tempo is the same, or twice faster for Caravan. 2 bars of Caravan equal 1 bar of The Man I Love. Since both pieces have the same structure, A1, A2 bridge, and A3, and for The Man I Love, A and B are 8 bar long, where the last 16 bars in Caravan. Anytime a change of scenario can be required. Here we change the last 4 bars of The Man I Love after 2, 3, or 4 rounds, and then ask for the chord progression of Caravan. The vertigo trick is that Caravan starts with a chord alternation between C7 and D flat 7, which is very similar to a transposed version of the famous bitonal chord Bernard Herrmann composed for Vertigo, the film by Alfred Hitchcock. We devised the vertigo sequence as a transition and tried to get the audience a little bit lost before the Duke Ellington theme can be recognized or perceived. What does the existence of a scenario imply? We keep the selling bow paradigm, since in general the outputs can be multiple and unexpected enough. Hervé Sellin noticed that as a performer, he had to deal with 2 concurrent and complex feedback processes. He could follow the scenario. He will be playing The Man I Love with Edith Piaf singing. He could follow the memory. He plays Piaf, and these sounds pervade the harmonic structure which happens to be The Man I Love. Of course, both processes generally coexist. Before speaking of the listening capacities of Infernal Machine 2, we should notice that first it creates an automatic alphabet of the repertory based on cut art, with 2 variables, the choice of descriptors and type of segmentation, and the size of the alphabet, which we could call n alpha. So the perceptual space will be divided into n alpha clusters, and all segments will be given a label of the corresponding cluster between 0 and n-1. On the right, we see the 3 descriptors used for our analysis of Be My Husband, sung by Diane Reeves in Montreux. In our particular case, we used 27 clusters, so the 3 minutes and 42 seconds of the song are divided into 445 segments labeled from 0 to 26. The alphabet must be tested by ear during rehearsals, and scenario can be designed accordingly. The consistency of the clusters are often very obvious, but they come out of a sort of black box and have in some way to be labeled after the fact. Selecting the descriptors and defining the cluster size is a crucial part when using this machine. Afterwards, Infernal Machine 2 can perfectly be used exactly like the preceding one, but as we will see, it's generally not the way it happens. Yes, the machine is listening. We just heard it responding to the piano of Hervé Sellin. How is it possible? Since the perceptive space defined by the descriptors is divided into clusters, it is possible to directly address the existing memory model and detect in real time where the entering sound of the piano stays inside this space, and more precisely, in which cluster. Therefore, a label can be assigned to the entering piano music. With this incoming label or collection of labels, a scenario can be devised. For example, the computer could start from a segment of the memory corresponding to the label just played and freely improvise from it, or come back to it, or repeat n labels, and so on. The length of the response, that is, of the generated scenario, can be set. On the example shown, it's a free improvisation of 8 events starting from label 11. But who listened to whom? There is a double logic of learning and listening processes. During the rehearsal, the machine first learns by listening to the repertoire. Then, if it analyzes the performer's input through the same model, it creates a double learning curve. Initially chosen to describe the memory, the descriptors end up later to be modified in order to fit also the input. Because, for instance, if all possible piano sounds fit only one single label of a percussion piece, it could become quite tedious. The performers listen to the memory not only through the system-made analysis, but also through the way their performance gets sieved through the same model. It's not only a double feedback process, piano listening to the machine, machine listening to the piano. The piano ends up resounding through the memory, and the memory ends up being heard as a resonance of the piano. The creative intelligence, if any, stems from these intertwined and concurrent processes, which are only possible because the performer constantly challenges the results. We're arriving at the end of this talk, and it's time to conclude. This system shows intelligent co-processes between machine and performers, and this in several ways. First, there's the sailing boat paradigm. The machines are creating musical surroundings rather than statements. Second, there's the scenario-memory duality. Scenario and memory propose concurrent and competing interactive processes on sound and on structure. Then there is a converging learning process, which is actually effected during rehearsal. In order to build a memory model for the repertoire, but this memory model can also be receptive to the sound of the performance. And finally, there are concurrent, co-influencing and intertwined listening processes where the performer's response to what is being played by the machine is heard by the system like being already part of the repertoire. I should end in saying that our team aims at systems inducing collaborative processes between experienced musicians and computer. Thank you very much for your attention. And we would like to thank all the performers spending so much time and passion on our crazy systems and infernal machines.
Hello, I'm Jérôme Nica. I'm a researcher in the music representations team at IRCAM, and I will present an overview of our research on musical generative agents and on creative interactions with generative processes, and in particular, the DYCI2 library that we develop in the team. So all the models and agents that I will present are based on an idea of musical memory, that is to say, the model that we build from an existing file, an existing stream, and we navigate through this memory to implement different strategies going from the composition of the narrative level of a piece or the composition of the behaviors of the agents that will be activated during the performance. So to begin with, this is the representation of what we call musical memory, coming from the first project at IRCAM dealing with human-computer co-improvisation, that is to say, the software OMAX. So the horizontal axis represents time, and all the events that you see are notes or musical events in this saxophone solo. And all the bridges, all the arches that you see represent links between parts of this solo sharing a common musical past. And what we call improvising with this kind of model is to navigate through this representation in a non-linear way, using those bridges, using those arches, to generate a new musical discourse that is not the original one, but which is consistent with the original one, thanks to this model and to these links. So now that we know how to model musical memory, we want to find different strategies to adapt the navigation in this memory to various types of interactions in various musical situations. So this memory is filled with musical events that can be content such as audio, MIDI, or other kind of musical events. And depending on the project, they can be labeled or observed regarding different dimensions, annotations, for instance, chord labels, semantic labels, or labels that deal with audio features. And our work here is to develop different generative processing using a model learned on the labels to generate new sequences. And the two directions that we study to do so are the notion of long-term planning and the notion of reactive listening. And we want to have a set of agents that can cope with a range of musical interactions between reactivity and planning. So I will show you three different paradigms between reactive listening and planning, and we will begin with the long-term planning strategy, which is adapted in the cases when we know a temporal structure that will guide the improvisation or the piece that we want to generate. And you had an example of the use of this scenario-based paradigm in another video with the performance Three Ladies by Georges Bloch and Hervé Sellin, where the scenario was the chord progression of the jazz standard The Man I Love, and the memory was filled with different singers. And the system was used to make these singers, Edith Piaf, Lisa de la Casa, match the scenario, which was the chord progression of The Man I Love. So our models can handle memories that are filled with events that are quite generic, that is to say musical contents labeled by labels. And if the labels are chord labels, for instance, the scenario can be a chord progression, or if we decide to extract audio features from the memory, the scenarios can be profiles of audio features that we want the generated piece to match. This is how we worked with composer Pascal Dussapin for the installation/concert Lullaby experience. So as you can see here, this project was to have the audience walking in a huge space among the actors and musicians. And in this huge space, we had a dome of around 70 loudspeakers. And in these loudspeakers, we broadcasted what we called singing clouds that were generated using this scenario paradigm. And the memory that we gave to the agent were lots of lullabies that we collected through a smartphone app. And then all these clouds were generated with different scenarios. So of course I don't have 70 loudspeakers here, but I will show you some reductions. So this is a simulation of what the system could propose when the scenario was, I want a first layer of voices around a given note, then another to form a chord. Or on another part of the space, you could have another singing cloud generated with another type of scenario. For instance, I want to have a group of voices singing around the same melody with this type of voices. So in this case, it is women and children. So this is what I called composing at the narrative level. Since what you compose is not temporal evolution of notes, but a higher level formal specification, that is to say a scenario. And in these examples, the scenario were fixed. And if we make this scenario notion dynamic, then we go to a second strategy, which is the combination of long-term planning and reactivity. That is interesting when we want to handle an hybrid temporality and to introduce multimodality. So the first aspect, as I said, is to make the scenario object dynamic. And in this case, the agent becomes a kind of software instrument of meta-DJing for the operator using the system, since the operator is triggering manually dynamic scenarios, that is to say, dynamic processes navigating through the memory. So this is the case in this example I will show you of performance with Steve Lehman, where in the first part, the accompaniment that you will hear is generated by short-term scenarios that are sent manually during the performance. And then you will see a transition between this first movement and the second movement, where the same agent is used not to generate an accompaniment anymore, but to augment the scenario in a reactive way using a memory that is filled with orchestral pieces. This example shows the versatility of the agent, since at the beginning we had, as I said, a kind of software instrument for meta-DJing, since we sent dynamic scenarios manually. And then in the second part, we were more in a kind of interaction with an autonomous creative agent, since we had an intelligent listening of the saxophone input to react to his solo to generate this augmentation with orchestral masses. And this is a transition to the last part, that is to say, to introduce a floating musical coordination without prior knowledge, thanks to a reactive listening paradigm. So, to be able to have this reactive listening, we first have to be able to analyze in an automatic way in the musical memory, to be then able to project the live input in this space, and then to create short-term scenarios matching these inputs. So I will show you first a tutorial of the library that shows how we tune the instrument when we want to learn a new memory. So in this example, I choose as a memory a bass solo, and I chose a lot of different descriptors to analyze my solo, and I decided to have 4 different clusters or families. And now I will just send short-term queries to the system to see if I'm okay with the way my instrument is tuned. So I load my memory, and now I want to hear what is class 0. So I'm quite happy because all the slices are harmonics. Class 1, let's say medium register. Class 2, lower register. And class 3, noises from the audience. So in this case, I'm happy because my instrument is tuned in a way that I have distinguished between different classes. And now I can use it as an instrument and to guide the navigation through this memory thanks to reactive listening. So the second step then is to listen to live inputs, to analyze them, and to project these live inputs in this space. So I will show you an example in a concert that we performed with Rémi Fox. So you will see 3 different moments of this concert. In the first moment, the system reacts to the texture of the sound of the saxophone. In the second part, you will see that the system listens to descriptors dealing with energy. And in the third part, the system reacts to the melody and harmony played by the musician. And now I will show you with other tutorials of the library how we do this kind of reactive listening, analyze, and then reaction to the inputs with the system. So in this example, we have a new module, which is a reactive listening module. So the same way as I did in the previous tutorial, I'm first loading a memory, which is here a saxophone. And now that my memory is ready, I will start a guiding input, a soprano. And you can hear that the saxophone is following the chroma of the soprano. We can try with another kind of memory and guiding input. So now I load a funk accompaniment. and when the memory is analyzed and built, it is guided by a saxophone. So in these examples, the results were quite rigid, and of course we can ask the system to match less and to develop its own discourse a little more. And this is the case in this new tutorial. So here we load an accompaniment memory and we guide it with a saxophone. Or we can guide it with another input. And of course, we can use several agents in parallel. And this library was not designed to produce proper accompaniment as in the tutorial that you just saw, but more to do what we will see in this example, that is to say, to produce its own discourse while being guided by the input coming from the musician. So in this example, you will see that I load a memory with two saxophones that are guided by another saxophone. Now I ask them to match less and to develop more. So to summarize, the process that we propose with this work is first to define an alphabet, to define the equivalences between the events and some possible transformations, and then once we have our memory that is built, to be able to navigate through this memory using reactive listening, short-term scenarios or meta-teaching, or fixed scenarios. And the last point I wanted to make before ending the presentation is the fact that all this research project is carried in collaboration with a lot of expert musicians, and that it is associated with a lot of different artistic productions. So I will just give some references of the ongoing projects. The installation by Vir-Andrés Herrà at Le Fresnois, which is a video installation where the system was used to generate a new language using some memories of a lot of different languages. There is another sound installation in Le Fresnois too, with musicians Rémi Fox and Steve Lehman, where we had the stimuli coming from the musicians that we could hear in open headphones, and the responses generated in real time by the agents were broadcasted thanks to loudspeakers in the space, so you have some photos here. Another ongoing project is the project by Marta Gentilucci using field recordings of environmental sounds, and using these field recordings to then compose and generate new sound objects, applying the structures of some masses to the textures of other masses. And we have other artistic projects coming soon with composer Alexandros Marqueas, with Rémi Fox, Steve Lehman, and Orchestre National de Jazz, among others. And I will conclude with this gallery of portraits of the musicians we worked with in the last 3 or 4 years. So this is it for the overview. I give you my contact below, and feel free to use it if you have any question. Thank you.
大家好，我叫许德章，我是来自于香港的作曲家、音乐人，创作或者 演奏，我觉得多多少少都会带有即兴的这样的成分在里面。无论是在你创作一开始的一个发想，然后你去把这个发想给扩展长大，这个对我来说跟即兴是有非常非常接近的一些性质的。然后当然在演出当中，演奏者众多不可预测的成分，也会是跟即兴是有相关的。然后我自己的第一件乐器其实是电吉他，然后在我年轻的时候我就有很多爵士音乐即兴的一些经验。然后当我进入创作这个或者古典音乐进入古典严肃音乐的创作这样的一个界别的时候，怎么去把即兴这个元素去融入在我的音乐当中呢？也是我一直在思考的一些问题，特别是在我早年的时候。然后我第一个运用到的即兴的方式或者元素，其实是来自于广东音乐。那也是因为我早年就是在香港音乐学院，那他们有非常深厚的这个广东音乐即兴的这样一个文化。然后广东音乐的即兴其实是跟江南丝竹是有点像的，说是基于一条旋律，大家都弹同一条旋律，然后他们可以在这条旋律上面加不同的装饰音，加花所谓的，或者减花，把一些音可以删除掉。然后基于这种方式，我也在我作品的不少的片段里面都会用到这样的技法，并不会是整首作品，并不会是我作品的主体。可是在我创造想要以一条旋律为中心去辐射开去的这样的一种肢体的时候，我就会经常会用到就所谓的支声复调的这样的 heterophony 的这样的一种音乐肢体。然后再下去呢，我对古琴音乐非常感兴趣。我们知道简字谱是指记录你的弹的位置、你弹的方式、你弹的手指之类的，可是这个节奏的记录是完全被删除掉的，就是没有，不是说他们不可以这样做，而是他们觉得这个东西他们不想要，就是节奏其实他们选择性的被过滤在这种乐谱上去的。那我自己觉得为什么？我自己的解释是，我觉得很有可能每一个音色、每一个环境、每一个它偶然发生的在乐器上跟他人手指上的这种非常细微的音色变化，都可以改变下一个音应该出现的时间。所以这种以音色为架构的一种即兴的方式呢，我也尝试去把它放在我的自己的作品当中。比如说现在你看到这个作品，就会有一个段落是完全没有，大家是完全没有时间的，是 timeless， 大家是在一个时间上面，大家听着大家看着大家的乐谱，然后听着大家的声音，然后在这些声音的流变当中去做反应。所以这个也是我在不同的作品里面都会有用到的一些小的技术，然后也是跟即兴有关的。然后真正跟严格意义说真正的即兴，就真的是即兴，而不是我写好的。然后最早我对这一方面有接触，其实是在荷兰一个 Alice Academy， 然后这个 Academy 是有来自于世界不同非常非常厉害的乐手，可是他们并不会读五线谱，并不会读乐谱。可他们音乐成分是完全不会比西洋音乐来的逊色，所以怎么去把他们这么丰富、这么有底蕴的音乐文化去融入到我们现在这样一个音乐世界当中，然后透过五线谱来沟通呢？然后我是采取了一些办法，就是我先把有五线谱的部分，可是他们看五线谱的时候，更多是一个看到更像是图形跟符号。到这个时候，你要去奏你们自己民族里面的某一些我听过的片段，然后这一部分我就会是用verbal， 就是用口语或者用其他一些方式去告诉他，就是排练的时候私下告诉他。所以乐谱其实是有很大缺少的一部分的。更多来说，乐谱只是建立了一个和声的框架，然后在这个和声框架上面，可以跟这些来自于世界各地，然后不会阅读五线谱的乐手去让他有一个平台去展示他的音乐。所以这个是另外一种我曾经尝试过的一种即兴的模式。或者其实不过说到这里为止，其实也不算是严格意义上的即兴。这些都是说，应该说，其实即兴怎么去定义，其实也非常困难，因为也带有一些，比如说 indeterminacy， 就是不确定性跟即兴，这个界限在哪呢？我觉得这个也是我自己一直在思考的。真正以一个 演奏者或者以一个在现场跟演奏家做互动，或者跟其他声音跟环境做互动的这样一种即兴模式呢，我自己作为一个 active 一个主动的参与者，其实是在我学习这个电子音乐之后。因为电子音乐本来就，比如说有很多不同的 effect， 本来这些 effect 就有非常多的不确定性，特别是有很多是根据现场的环境的声音来做互动的时候，然后每一次的声音都可能不一样，所以我们的参数也每一次不可能说设的一模一样，所以我的可以说这个即兴的部分是在于我去改变这些参数。然后我做过不同的尝试，比如说跟不同的演奏者在不同的场合去做一些乐器跟电脑互动的即兴，比如说乐器进入到电脑之后，然后我用不同的 effect 去改变它的音色，比如说这里有一小段。可是我一直都遇到一个小问题，就是在音乐的架构上面呢，很容易会流于是从一种音乐形态，然后 crossfade， 然后交叠到另外一种音乐的形态当中。所以怎么可以在这个音乐的大的架构上面有更好的规划，然后即兴的这些不可确定性的，还有一些不可预知的一些色彩，还可以保留在作品当中呢？其实在现在我也还是在寻找当中。然后有另外一个我的尝试是一定要用到即兴的是现场的ambience noise， 现场的环境的声音，然后我进入到我的电脑之后，然后我经过我电脑，我实时的去对这些环境声音这些 ambience 去做互动，这个也是我的尝试之一。可以先看一个片段，现在会放一小段，就是我最近的其中一首作品，是利用是有从香港到台湾，然后到历史片段各种类型的不同的一些影音素材，比如说你现在看到是在香港的一个战争时期的一些已经有的一些素材，然后我在现场的利用电子音乐去跟这些片段去做互动。然后最后还有一些是实时的，然后通过实时的就是在台湾街头有人拿着一个手机在台湾街头去游荡，然后声音进入到我的电脑里面，然后我利用我的所有的这些已经做好的这些 effect 去跟这些环境声音去做互动。然后这里有几个小的例子，然后这个是第一段。比如说你刚刚看到这一段，就是我现场跟一个像 VJ 一个 video artist， 他实时的去做一些 processing， 对这个 video， 然后我实时的看到他做出的东西，然后我用我有的声音的素材去做互动，然后这里也是另外一段。 好，刚刚看到这一段会有乐器的部分，可是乐器的部分，所以这个即兴也不是完完全全的即兴。其实我们在跟这个 video artist 跟演奏者，其实我已经是预先是有规划的，在什么段落我们会有什么样类型的素材，虽然是不确定，可是我们框架已经是定好的。所以即兴的部分更多是有一些细节的部分，并不是大结构上面，所以我是更倾向于这样一种形式的结构，的即兴的结构或者作品的结构架构是建好的，然后即兴更多是现场或者一些小的细节上面的变化，然后最后这个就是真的是完全即兴了，就是街头的声音，然后进入到画面，进入到我的电脑。好，讲到这里，大家可能也发现到，我这里所说的即兴其实是很单向的，所以其实是我决定好什么，然后操控的人也是我，所以其实还是没有脱离这个作曲家这样的身份。我可以说，直到最近在做的另外一个新的 project， 就是我接下去想要跟大家聊的，就是一个为30个小孩子写的这样一个作品。直到这个 project 以前，我觉得我以前的即兴其实是更多的还是像传统作曲家这样的一个身份去靠拢。所以最后我想跟大家介绍我现在正在创作的一个作品，这个作品还在构思当中，不过里面就有我不得不一定要运用到即兴的这样的部分了。然后这个案子是为龙山国小，在七股的龙山国小30位小学生，年龄大概是7到11岁，然后他们完全没有任何音乐的训练，然后之前也没有之前有参加过不同的活动，演出的活动，可是音乐对他们说，或者看五线谱啊、演奏乐器啊，这些对他们来说是非常陌生的，然后大部分来说肯定是不会的。那我要怎么去为他们去做一个演出，做一个展演，然后让他们站在舞台上，然后找一个方法是我可以让他们之间沟通，然后可以跟我沟通，或者跟电子音乐沟通。所以即兴在这一部分就变得是我觉得是必要的，就像是一个链合机这样去把不同的东西给贴在一起。然后关于这个即兴，我也想提一下另外一个概念是叫乐动。然后乐动 musicking 其实是说有一个非常重要的概念是音乐更多的是一个活动，而不是一种物件，不是一个抽象的物件，它是一个过程。所以我觉得我也希望是让这些小孩子在通过去演奏，去或甚至于参与到创作的时候，或者是聆听，只是单单的聆听别人，聆听电子音乐，聆听他们身边的声音，积极的聆听。所以这个聆听是他们有意识的去聆听这些声音的时候，他们可以发现到透过声音去理解人跟人，或者他人跟这个世界跟其他事情的一些关系。我自己是非常喜欢这样的一个概念，然后我觉得这次是刚好有一个很强的机会，一个非常我觉得很合理的一个机会去让我实现这件事情。怎么去建立第一步的交流呢？所以要先为他们创作，我第一件事情是先去了解他们， 然后跟他们去做不同的交流。所以我们第一个阶段做的现在是跟他们做非常非常多的访问，然后不是一次，有可能是2次、3次、4次，不断的去问他们，觉得他们身边有什么有趣的他们龙山国小附近或者七股这个地带有什么是值得艺术家去，你想什么去借着这个案子，或者借着作曲家的手或者艺术家的手，去把人家去展现你们龙山或者七股什么样的一个面貌所以也可以说，我们是希望通过这样的一种共融艺术这样的形态的一种作品，去把偏向的文化去融入在严肃艺术或者当代艺术当中，然后同一时间也把就是当代艺术这个好像是比较程式化的这个东西去带到偏向进去，这也是我们想做的。所以除了访问以外，我还教他们写了非常非常非常多的一些文章，其实也是他们作文功课的一部分不过里面有日记，有故事。然后我们非常有趣的是，发现有一些议题或者有一些有一些东西是不断的在他们这些文章里面去重复的，比如说有海有风这是因为他们是临海的一个城市，然后有蚝也是因为他们是产蚝的一个地方。然后当然他们会一直提到他们的祖父母，因为这种偏乡城市，大家知道爸爸妈妈可能都在大城市工作，所以很多时候都是奶奶或者阿嬷阿公去带的，所以一直其实也会没有意识的，他们在写这些作文的时候都会流露在他们的这些文章当中。然后还有一些议题就是比较再抽象一点，比如说有一些概念是离别的概念征服，然后还有是被拯救或者拯救别人，这是他们非常非常爱的一些话题。所以我想写一个故事或者做一个作品是可以呈现这些面貌的。所以我挑了一个小孩子出海的一个故事，就有点像老人与海，或者说是小孩与海这样一个故事去展示，让他们这30个学生可以有一个刚刚我说的架构，就是以故事作为架构，然后让他们在这个故事架构上面去做即兴。然后我要先去界定我有的这个框架里面我有的材料是什么呢？或者这个框架的边界是什么？有什么是我可以做，什么是我不可以的？他们小孩子可以做什么呢？然后在探索这个过程的时候，我们就发现他们是，当然他们是有场地的，所以起码有一件乐器我可以用，不过他们是不会吹。不过非常幸运我们找到一些专业的一些音乐家去教导他们，然后有2到3课的时间，就最初步的让他们可以刚好接触到这个乐器，然后这个乐器他们可以掌控的部分是非常非常少，所以是不可能要他们写一个五线谱叫他们去演，那根本是不现实。那这个时候呢，就是即兴就是要介入到我们这个创作当中。我要用什么的方式去让他们可以在他们的技术层面去掌控到这个乐器，然后还可以呈现出音乐，然后还可以让他们之间去做互动呢？然后我们是思考了一些不同的方法。然后除了场地以外，那还有很多的 pipe， 就是 PVC 的这种胶管，然后他们老师也非常好，帮我们去做非常多的胶管，除了用来做不同的长度有不同的音高以外，还可以挖孔就会产生不同的音高，也是可以像长笛一样去拿来吹。然后当然还有很多身边各种可以用来当敲击乐的这种小孩子都可以用来当做，应该说可以做制造音响跟制造节奏这一部分。然后除了刚刚说的乐器的部分呢，当然他们的声音呢，他们的对话，他们的讲话的声音，然后他们吹口哨或者他们在利用声音去做的一些延伸技法，还有就是行动的装置，比如说有没有可能是用过 Mirror Web， 这是在 MaxMSP 里面的 Mirror Web， 去让他们的手机呢，他们的 iPad 去跟这个主机这个你可以说整个这个作品的一个大脑去沟通，然后让他们去实时的去控制这个作品的电子音乐的部分呢。那这个是我现在也在做的，这个你可以看到我也会把他们熟悉的声音，海啊水啊，就是我们有实地采样，然后采到他们学校里面的声音，他们附近海的声音，然后有人在挖蚝壳的声音，然后我们就把它放在一个他们可以去操控的形式， 的这样一个 patch， 让他们去玩，然后去跟其他的小孩子做互动。所以你可以看得到书有几部分呢，有一些小孩子或者他们有时候是吹长笛，然后有时候会去讲话，或者去唱歌，或者去对话，或者去做一些theatrical 的，就是戏剧性的一些效果在舞台上。然后有一些是用来操控电子音乐的。我希望我在这个作品当中的角色是退到0。所以是完全交给他们，我把电子音乐都做好，然后就让他们去做互动。基于我刚刚说的，就是一个我们一起建构起来的这样一个故事上面。然后另外还有一些让他们去沟通的方法。我们没有五线谱怎么办呢？然后我发现一个其实挺常见的、挺常用的一个方法，就是用像9宫格或者像格仔这样的形式，它是有一点像声音的地图，里面可以填任何的东西，你可以填数目字，可以填 ABC， 可以填中文字，然后小孩子可以自由的往，就是有在一个格的中心往格仔的另外一个方向，可以上下左右去移动，然后有这样的模型。可是在这样，如果这个地图做得够大的话呢，我就可以稍微的，然后他们的开始的时间也是规划好的话了，然后我就虽然是不完全的规划好他们的路线，可是大约他们的走向我是可以控制的，利用这样的方法。然后这种9宫格的形式还有一个好处是，里面可以是他们的东西是很直观的，小孩子看到那个就是做某一个动作，所以这个在practically 就是一个实用性来说是我觉得是挺好用的。然后当然还可以用图像了。然后还可以用一些引导式的语言，比如说我可以放一小段，就是大家看最熟悉的声音，比如说雨或者风或者船号，因为他们是临海的城市，然后他们用他们的长笛，用他们的那个 PVC 胶管可以做出什么声音呢？我让他们去思考，然后让他们去做一些小的排练，然后叫他们去呈现给我看，然后这个是一个小的片段。刚刚大家听到，就是在这些小孩子在受过1个多小时 之后训练可以达到的成果。然后如果你问我限制大不大呢？那当然是大的，比平常为大。可是我自己觉得每一次在我创作的时候会有很大的限制，其实也是一个机遇，因为有个机遇去让我塑造一个有特色的一个作品。然后还有我回到我讲座一开头说的这三种形式的这个即兴的框架，这个以旋律为中心的即兴框架，有没有可能在现在这样的一个 context 这样的语境下去实现呢？完全是可以的。比如说用他们的校歌，用当地的一些音乐素材，用民间调子。然后如果是以和声的话，可能限制稍微来说大一点。你可以看得到他们吹的音可以吹到的音可能不多，可是我们也可以围绕着以一个中心音，他们可以吹到的音为中心音去辐射开，然后让这个音改变这个音的属性。然后我们有电子音乐，我们还有其他一些声音的素材去可以改变这个和声的这个架构的。然后还有最后音色相对来说是我们这个案子里面最丰富的一块，大家看到各种各样的声音。对小孩子来说他们反而没有包袱，他们去发掘这些音色的时候，我觉得他们更多的时候是非常主动，也非常愿意去尝试。比起很多比较保守的演奏家，他们更愿意尝试或者可以找得到的音色，并不会比他们来得少。所以我觉得机会还是非常大，大的就是。可是还有一个另外一个问题，就是我们互动的形式，怎么去跟这些小孩子去沟通，然后让他们之间去做互动。说实话，这个限制也还是大，就是除了以这种图形和文字为方式的这样的一个架构。可是如果我们把刚刚说的，如果把故事给加进去，然后他们更有一个方向性的话，我觉得也是可以把这个问题给克服的。今天我就希望用我以前有的一些小经验来跟大家分享一下我对即兴的一些看法。感谢大家。